I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what a model actually is, because in programming we use the word model a lot. There's database models, there's data architecture models, there's system architecture models, class models, architecture models. There's all different kinds of models that we use in programming, but within the context of MVC, model has a reasonably specific definition. Model are the classes that represent the domain of your application. Now, if you've never heard the word domain before, it's kind of a fancy word for the stuff that your application works with. It's the area that your application is trying to cover. For example, if you were building a web application for a bank, your domain might be things like checking accounts, savings accounts, loan applications. Those are the kinds of things your application would manage and deal with. If you were developing an application for a university, then your domain might be things like students, classes, teachers, facilities. So that's what a model actually is. It's the classes that represent the actual things, the entities that your application is going to deal with. It's important to note that a model is not database tables. Some people get confused about that when they think about the model view controller pattern and they know that the model is the data. They assume that's a database. But a model is classes. They consist of the actual classes that mimic your data, but they're not database tables themselves. So you might have a database populating your model, and you might have your model saving data back into a database, but the model itself are classes that represent your entities. They represent your data. They're not the actual physical, database tables that your system might work with. They are, however, the entities that you will perform data operations on most of the time, like creating, saving, viewing, and editing. So some examples that you might have of models would be things like a customer, a student might be a model class in some applications, dog, product, shopping cart. Whatever the actual business objects are that your application is going to manage, that defines what your model classes are going to be. In order to take a look at how we use models in MVC applications, I want to start out by first creating a default application. So I'm just going to come up here to File, New, Project, and I'm going to create an ASP.NET MVC4 web application in Visual C#, and I'm just going to call this Bookstore. You can of course call it something else if you want, or save it somewhere else. Go ahead and create a directory for the solution. I'm going to hit OK, and then I'm going to get my project template screen, and I'm going to use Internet Application. This is the default project template for MVC4. It will go ahead and stock it with some default views, default controllers, and default models. I'm not going to create a unit test project. I'm going to hit OK. It's going to think for a minute. Okay, if you've ever worked with MVC4 before, you might recognize this project. It's a pretty good starting point. Even when you're fairly familiar with MVC4, I still find myself coming to this default project to kind of get me started. So one of the things I want to take a look at is in this project, there's a folder called Models, and when we open it up, we don't really have a lot going on here. And that's because this application, this default application, it doesn't know what kind of application we're going to build. It's just setting up some default things. It doesn't know what kind of problem area we're going to be dealing with. So the only models it has in it are classes that deal with user accounts. So if I open this up and I take a look at these classes, we'll see there's a class for user profile that has a user ID and a username. There's an external login model, a local password model, a regular login model, username, password, and remember me. There's some attributes here that mark up this model, but as you can see, these models are all very specific to logging in, logging out, getting your password, the kinds of things that you might expect to find on several different websites, and that's why this particular set of models comes with the default. Well, what we're going to do is we're actually going to start modeling out a bookstore. Now, usually when you start building an application, it's not necessarily a great idea to sit down and just start writing a bunch of model classes, because even though the models are sort of the core of your application, you may not know what problem you're trying to solve up front. And so this is a good time to talk with your clients, talk with your users, figure out the kind of features that they want, how you want this application to behave, and sort of prioritize that list, pick the top one, and then start building your model from there. So let's say in our particular example, we are going to have a bookstore, and we decide that the first thing we want to do is to be able to manage our inventory. So we want models that will enable us to list, create, edit, and delete books. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click on the models folder, and I'm going to say add new item. And you'll notice I have all these different MVC specific items, but in actuality, all I really want to add is just a plain class. So I'm going to come over here to code, and I'm going to pick class, and I'm going to make my first model class, which will be book. Okay, so you can see we've got public class book here. And I'll get rid of some of these using statements. We might not need them. We might bring them back later. But right now, all we really need is this class. Now, you can simplify this whole process just by right-clicking, saying add, and picking class down here. But I wanted to show you that this is actually very distinct from some special MVC thing. It's just a regular class like you would build in any application. So I'm going to start putting some fields in here. Let's see, let's make some properties. Let's go public, and I'm actually going to make these virtual, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but just bear with me. Okay, so we'll make a property for the ID. Very important to have identifiers for your main objects in your system. And I'm also going to give this a, I don't know what you call it, I'm going to call it genre. You know how when you go to the library, they have like the Dewey Decimal System, or you know, if you go into a bookstore, you have the books arranged by category, you know, sort of by genre. So I'm going to add that in here. Have you ever noticed that they put the science fiction books and the romance books right next to each other in bookstores? Do you think it's because they want those people to find each other? I've always wondered that. Anyway, I'm going to come back down here and let's just add a few more properties. Let's put in an author ID. What we're going to do is we're going to end up connecting this class to all these other entities that are going to be part of our model. And, oh, you know what? It would probably be a good idea to have a title. And how about, last but not least, let's put a price on this book. And let me make sure my string up here is virtual. Now, as I finish this up, I want to say that normally, if you're just making a plain Jane model class, you probably will not make all these properties virtual. The reason that I'm doing it right now is because I'm going to want to use these classes eventually with an object relational mapper called Entity Framework. And it needs to have the ability to override these properties to add its own special magic to them, and that's why these are virtual, so that it can create its own classes that will add a little magic to these properties. But normally speaking, if you're just coming up with a model and you're not worried about a specific database or object relational system or anything like that, you probably won't have virtual in here. But I do want to point that out, since I will be using Entity Framework with these classes at some point in the future. Then I'm going to go ahead and make these virtual so it can override them. I will say that a lot of object relational mappers work in a similar way. So if you plan on using an object relationship mapper, you might think about making your properties virtual right out of the box, or you might wait and see if you need to do that. Okay, so this is going to imply a few other entities here, for instance, genre and author. Now, I don't just want the IDs, I actually want to go ahead and create a relationship between the book and the genre and the author. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm just separating these out visually. Okay, now the reason this is red is because I don't have a genre class yet. We're going to add it to our model. Alright, so let's go ahead and add our author class and our genre class. So I'm going to add a new class, doing it the slightly faster way this time. And let's add the author. Whenever you add a class, Visual Studio likes to help you out with all the using statements, but I don't really need them. Okay, and for this, I'm just going to add an ID. Just to kind of keep this simple, I'm just going to add a name. Now when I make this author class, if I flip back over here to book, okay, now author is no longer red because I've defined it. This is not uncommon when you're building a model for the very first time, because you just have a lot that needs to be built out. You don't always know up front exactly what you're going to need. So let me add another class for the genre. Incidentally, it doesn't hurt anything if you leave those using statements in. Just as a personal preference, I like to get rid of them, but if you prefer to leave them in or just don't want to mess with them, they do not hurt anything. I just like to clear them away so that we don't have quite so much clutter on the screen. Do the genre ID. Do the name of the genre. And you know, we could put other things in here like a genre description or something like that. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a list, and now I'm going to need this using statement up here to use the list. Now if you've worked with databases before, this might seem fairly straightforward to you, but if you haven't, let me explain it to you real quick. Every book is going to have a single author, okay, and authors can write lots of books. In theory, I might want to add a collection of books here to author, but what's definitely going to happen is we're going to have a genre that has more than one book in it. Every book has one genre, but a genre is going to have tons of books in them, you know, so like science fiction, that's going to have lots and lots of books in it. So I'm creating sort of a two-way relationship here. In database terms, we might call this a one-to-many. So what this allows me to do then is in my application, if I'm looking at a page and looking at a genre, this property will give me access to all the books in that genre. And if I'm on a page looking at a single book, this will give me access to anything about the genre I need. So this is enough to have a simple model. The things you need to keep in mind are these are just plain classes, and you need to have identifiers for all your main entities, and you can create relationships between them.